like Elizabeth Bjork as well as me. You want to stand and wave to people. Often, when there's Bjork on the slide, it'll be Elizabeth Bjork rather than Robert Bjork. But there are exciting things happening here, and it's really fun to hear about them. And I'm going to kind of jump right into it with kind of a basic point. And then a major problem we confront as we're teachers or students ourselves is that conditions of instruction that make performance improve rapidly often fail to support long-term retention and transfer, whereas other conditions that appear to create difficulties for their learners, slowing the rate of apparent learning, often optimize long-term retention and transfer. And things in this latter category, over 20 years ago, I coined the term desirable difficulties. They're difficulties for sure, but they're desirable because they enhance the very goal of learning and instruction. But this pattern leads us to be susceptible to misinterpreting whether learning's happened or not, and susceptible to choosing poorer conditions of instruction over better conditions. And so I could now spend the rest of this talk on, that's actually me doing that. Going over results like that, where these are experiments on metacognitive processes where people are making a judgment, like predicting how well they'll perform a later test, choosing between alternative methods of instruction, evaluating the quality of some procedure or another. And what I've shown here in a number of experiments is there's some manipulation with different procedures, and it produces the performance differences that are shown in red, but then shown in blue are the predictions, choices, selections of the learners. And you want to give an illustration of a negative correlation. This is a good one. And those come from different kinds of experiments on different things, but the basic point is it's easy to get misled in terms of what are and are not effective conditions of learning, and for that matter, as a learner, whether or not you have achieved the goals of a learning procedure. Now, why are learners and teachers fooled? Well, one thing is, and we'll emphasize several times, this fundamental distinction that learning and performance are different things. This distinction that goes back to animal research in the 1930s. But basically, when we measure performance, it can be a product of local conditions, cue support, recency, a whole bunch of other things. And it becomes a very unreliable and often misleading index of whether learning's happened, where we measure learning by retention at a delay or by transfer of that learning to where it's relevant. And basically then what we can observe is performance, what we're trying to infer is learning. And we can also get misled by subjective indices of performance, a sense of perceptual fluency, retrieval fluency. I'll come back to this one at the end, egocentrism in social communication. I mean, even something as simple as a student reading a chapter a second time, very low-level perceptual processes will create a sense of greater fluency of reading the chapter. And that can be confused with understanding the content of the chapter. So that's another thing, and then a big factor, we can be prone to counterproductive beliefs and biases that effective learning is easy learning, that we should block practice and be organized, and hindsight bias is a variety of those things. Now, these desirable difficulty manipulations include varying the conditions of learning rather than keeping them constant and predictable, distributing or spacing study or practice sessions rather than masking or blocking them, using tests rather than presentations as learning events, and something we're doing a lot of research on recently, interleaving rather than blocking the separate components of to-be-learned tasks. And we will come back to that at the end. I'm going to say a little bit about the first two and quite a bit more about the second two. Just for time reasons, cutting it a bit short on the first couple. I always have to emphasize the word desirable is important. Many difficulties are undesirable during learning, after learning, forever after. I kind of learned I had to do this when early on giving some talks. I remember in particular one aging professor like me coming up and saying, you know, I have been confusing my students for years and now you tell me it's a good thing. That's not quite the point here. They're desirable because responding to them, overcoming them, contending with them, engages the very processes that support learning, comprehension, and remembering. They can become undesirable if the learner is not equipped to respond to them successfully. So, for example, as teachers, we should always and routinely try to get our students to generate an idea, a concept, an answer, rather than give it to them. There's a whole bunch of research showing far better long-term memory if something's generated than when there's just read again. But the learner has to be equipped to succeed at the generations. And the amount of support might differ across students in order to enable the generation. So it's a matter of titrating these difficulties for individual learners. Varying the conditions of learning, just two quick examples. One of my all-time favorite experiments was done in a recreation park with kids, 8-year-olds and 12-year-olds, and I'll just focus on the 8-year-olds. The results were the same. And what these kids had to do as a task is there's a box of sort of miniature bean bags. I'll just step away a second. And they, in a kneeling position, they had to try to land the beanbag on a target on the floor, a 4x4 black square on the floor. The tricky thing, what made it hard, is right before they threw each time, a screen pull down blocked their vision. They would throw, and then they could see how well they did. So half of the kids in this experiment practiced, in the 8-year-old, practiced at a 3-foot distance, a lot of trials. The other kids practiced at a mixture of 2 feet and 4 feet, but never 3 feet. And I won't show you the sort of learning curve, so to speak, during the practice stage, because it's what you would expect. The group throwing it the same distance all the time did better than the group that was 2 feet and 4 feet. Then at the end, and after a couple of weeks went by, they were brought back and tested, and now they were all tested at the 3-foot distance. And you might expect, well, half the kids practice at that very distance. But you're also thinking, you wouldn't be showing me these results. So this is absolute error in terms of average inches from the center of the target. And so the kids that never threw at the 3-foot distance, threw at a mixture of 2 feet and 4 feet, do better at the 3-foot distance. And you can start, if we had more time today, we'd discuss why that should be true or could be true. But it's a dramatic indication of some of the benefits of varied practice. And I'm actually quoted, I have a long story about this, but I'm quoted in Time magazine suggesting that the Lakers have Shaquille O'Neal practice at a mixture of 14 and 16. He couldn't make a free throw, and maybe if he practiced at 14, 16 rather than thousands of ones at 15 feet. And I actually think it's probably true, but we never carried out that actual experiment. And so there's a lot of dimensions of variation that matter, even the variation in context. And this is the experiment we did way back in my years, early years at Michigan. And participants here, there were 2 different rooms. Room A was a kind of nice seminar room on the 6th floor, looked down at the central diagonal Michigan campus. Room B we made as different in every way we could think of. It was in a basement. It had some used rat cages on one side. The experimenter, Steve Smith, who's now on the faculty at Texas A&M, he was an undergrad then, dressed so differently in both cases that some participants didn't recognize him. But in any case, they studied the material in one of these rooms, let's just say room A. They went away for 3 hours and came back, and in one condition, they were then tested either in room A or tested in the other room. And there was a context effect. They remembered somewhat more when they were back in the same place where they studied the material. But half the time, instead of being tested, they studied the material a second time, either in the same room or the other room. Then they went away for 3 hours and they were tested in a third place, a big open classroom. And then this condition, the context change that produced more forgetting in the top case, then enhanced learning. And when we tested it at a delay. And that's actually a theme. There's a number of conditions that introduce forgetting, but then enhance learning if there's an opportunity to restudy. This has always been kind of interesting because probably on this campus, or at least most campuses, you pick up some little guide that's on how to study. And what are one thing students are told about maximizing their study? Find some good place to study and do all your study there. It might help you get to study, but it will not apparently help you recall what you have studied. And then the other one that deserves lots of comments, won't get much today, is a result of the spacing effect that actually goes back to the very beginnings in 1885 of controlled research on human learning and memory. And this just refers to the fact that if something is studied twice, and it's either like in the top case, studied once and then studied right away again, like a student deciding to read a chapter again to see what they missed right away. Or you study it once, you go on to other real world activities of some kind, then you come back and study it here. Then, when there's a test at a delay, you see a benefit of this bottom case, and sometimes actually a very large benefit, and a very general benefit. It shows up in research with animals, with kids, with motor skills, with verbal learning, a very general effect. However, there's a kind of qualification. If instead of testing at some delay, you test essentially immediately, then there's often an advantage of the massing, a small advantage. And this corresponds to what? Grammar. And as I've told students over the years, you know, if it's the night before and you don't know the material, cram. There are very little sleep loss effects at that age. You're not going to go to sleep and make something out of nothing while you sleep. Cram. That's to sort of save their grade point average. But then, if they do well on the exam, what's the problem? Very rapid forgetting. And to the degree that that content provides a foundation for the next course or whatever, this is a very bad thing to do. I try to clarify that too. I don't just tell them always cram. Okay. Now, somebody wants to say a little bit more about using tests rather than presentations, learning events. And for some audiences, I don't think this one, from some of the things I've heard people say, testing is a very bad word. And we've actually, Elizabeth and I had some groups we talked to where we eliminated that word entirely from the talk and instead said retrieval practice. That changes everything for some parents and teachers and so on. But the important thing is to just how important testing is as pedagogy rather than assessment. The reason testing is a bad word for a lot of people, they think of it in its role of assessment. But as a pedagogical tool, it has all of these benefits. Retrieving information, it's a memory modifier. The recalled information becomes more recallable in the future than would have been otherwise, and equally important. I'll skip over. Is this one, competing information becomes less accessible. I see that I put this example on here. It's substantially more powerful than being presented information. This inflatable life vest example, what that refers to is some years back, rushing in an exhausted way to the airplane. I plopped in the seat just in time, and the flight attendant was showing the inflatable life vest procedure. And I thought, oh, geez, how often have I seen this? 100 times? But for whatever reason, I said, but do I know how to do it? So I closed my eyes. I imagined the plane was down in the water. There were some people screaming. A faint smell of smoke. There was lights came on the aisle. Okay, do I know how to do it? Do you know how to do it? Where's the life vest? Quick, plane's in the water. You put it up, someone put it down. Okay, it's under your seat, but like how under your seat? Like in a Velcro bag, or is it just hanging there? Anyway, I assume I fumbled with this thing and held it up. The stewardess seems to know right away which is front and back and so on, so I assumed I put it over my head. Then what? Quick. Then someone said you breathe in the tube.
You put it on your head and you tie the bag.
She's got the mask and the vest completely. Don't fly with her. So in any case, that's one of the. Okay, you tighten it around. Assuming you can find the straps, you tighten it. Then the next thing is what? Then you try to yank. If that doesn't work, you do what? So I imagine that I blew it up, whatever, and I came, and then getting out the window, I found out you're not supposed to blow it up before you get out the window. So in any case, once in giving a talk at the Air Traffic Control Center in Oklahoma City, I actually suggested if there was one place in the airport where you got all that time to kill anyway, if you could go in there and do it once, the whole thing, that would be worth more than 50 or 100 of these passive observations. It's an extreme case. Then maybe they give you a little button that says, follow me, I know how to get out of the plane. Something like that. So basically, it's a fundamental property of human memory that using our memories shapes our memories, and mostly in adaptive ways. Another virtue is testing provides far better feedback as to what's been learned or not learned than does restudy. A student trying to judge by scanning through the textbook what they still need to study will make very flawed judgments. Getting together with another student and ask each other questions, that will be very good judgments. And testing potentiates the effectiveness of subsequent learning, even when few or no correct answers can be produced, and I'll show you some of those results today. So one example of the power of testing versus presentations as learning events is that this well-known study by Roediger and Karpicki, participants studied a to-be-learned passage either on the sun or on sea otters. It was structured so that when people tried to recall the passage, what they studied, there were about 30 idea units that could be scored. It didn't need to be verbatim, but did you recall those basic idea units? And two conditions of particular interest is in one case, the learners, the participants, had 4 consecutive 5-minute study periods to go over this, to underline, to whatever they wanted. In the other case, they did that once, and then they were given a sheet of paper and asked to try to recall it for 5 minutes. That sheet was taken away. No feedback was given. That's important to understand. They were given another sheet. They tried again for 5 minutes, and that was taken away in 5 minutes. So they studied it 4 times, or they studied it once and tried to recall it 3 times. So this just diagrams what I've said, and you can see there was a very big difference between how much they went over the passage in this top case than in the bottom case. And then they were tested either 5 minutes later, or half the people weren't tested until a week later in these 2 conditions. And again, no feedback during the tests. So at 5 minutes, the results look sort of sensible, that if you studied it 4 times, you're better than if you studied it 1 time. But a dramatic difference from a week later. Very little forgetting in the case where you were repeatedly tested, pretty dramatic forgetting in the case where you just did no study. They also incorporated a metacognitive question, so there's the basic results again. They asked them, how much will you remember in 1 week's time? And that's their predictions, as opposed to the actual results. And just one more example, there's many cases where people's own judgments are at odds with the actual results. But what about multiple choice testing? Do such benefits also arise with multiple choice testing? A widespread opinion is no. They're viewed as failing to engage these productive kind of retrieval processes. The correct answer is there, and so maybe it bypasses retrieval. Instead, test takers rely on maybe recognizing, and there are some studies that make it look like it's better to cued recall than multiple choice testing. But is this an intrinsic property of multiple choice testing? Or can they be written to trigger productive retrieval processes? And not only why the correct alternative is correct, but also why an incorrect alternative is incorrect. My interest in this goes back all the way to when I was an undergraduate physics major and had the physics sequence from a great teacher the whole year at the University of Minnesota. And he, in contrast to everybody else, gave a multiple choice final examination. Everybody else had, 10 questions or something, show your work, and that was scored. He had like 40 multiple choice, 30. But what he had done was every alternative that was wrong was the one you would end up at if you had a reasoning problem or a confusion sometime. So he had structured those questions. And I know I had the sense of never feeling quite so well sort of examined as in that case. And that sort of kept an interest of, could multiple choice tests be made more effective? And can we make a multiple choice test so that it would trigger why the incorrect alternative is incorrect, and then maybe that helps you answer a different question at a later time. And that's what we set out to explore, where we as Elizabeth Bjork, and in particular, student then working with us, Jerry Little. She's not so far away now. She's at Cal State East Bay teaching there. And did a whole series of experiments. This was the first paper, but I want to mention a few of those. In that first study, the participants studied 2 passages, one on geysers in Yellowstone Park, the other on the solar system. And then they got either a cued recall test, I'll give you an illustration in a moment, or a multiple choice test on one of those 2. The other one became a control condition. And then a final cued recall test. And so, for example, the initial test, if it was cued, might be in 1655, who became the first scientist to suggest that Saturn is surrounded by a ring? That would be the cued recall version. Or in the other one, the same question followed by those 4 alternatives. And then on the final test, you could have exactly the same previously tested question, again in cued recall form, or it could be a control question from the other passage, or, and this is of primary interest, it could be related. Who first proposed that Saturn's rings weren't solid, but instead composed of many small particles? And what we found in that results, those results, is as far as the previously tested, you're better having an initial test than not having an initial test, but the advantage is bigger if it's multiple choice. And then the thing we're really interested in is new questions that were related. And as you can see, if it's multiple choice, you do better on those new questions than in the control condition. And if its initial test is cued recall, you actually do a little worse. In this case, it was significant. In other experiments, not always been significant, but the initial cued recall does not help and may hurt recall of other information. Now, why would that be? Our sort of analysis is something illustrated here. Why would an initial cued recall test cause retrieval-induced forgetting? This phenomenon that is, I select some things, I select against the others, and that leads them to become less accessible. So we tried to illustrate it here. Who became the first scientist to suggest that Saturn is surrounded by a ring? Those might be the contenders. As I select eigens, I select against the others and make them less accessible. And when they then become the right answer to another question, I do a little bit worse. Whereas, if this is the other question, say, whereas if it's initial multiple choice test, it might be this kind of thing. One thing didn't work right there, but I think about each alternative and then settle on one. And during that process of thinking why they might be wrong, I may come up with the right answer, Maxwell to the other one. This is the kind of dynamic that we think is going on and underlies the benefits of multiple choice testing in this case. Importantly, the incorrect alternatives must be competitive. Which outer planet was discovered by mathematical predictions rather than direct observation. If it's one like this, it may trigger, was it Uranus? No, that's one with a strange orbit and tilted axis, you might think through. But whereas if it's where they're not competitive, like Neptune, Mars, and Mercury, it's just, hey, Neptune's the only outer planet. So the dynamics we're talking about, the benefits require that the incorrect alternatives be competitive, be plausible. If they're not, these kind of bad questions are easy to write, and the good ones are hard to write, and that's one of the problems we have with multiple choice tests. So overall tests potentiate subsequent learning, but what about failed tests? What happens when learners produce an error on those tests? Maybe that impairs subsequent learning, become more prone to remembering these errors. And I got this message a while back, unsolicited, from somebody wanting to educate me. They're an instructional designer. They say avoid errors entirely. And I hadn't quite thought through this, that the students might develop an error history. That's later difficult to break this habit of making errors. But then the second one in particular, minimizing errors, it reduces emotional and aggressive behavior that can occur falling. So I mean, like, your safety as an instructor is at risk if you introduce too many errors. But do we learn our errors? So I won't give a big background on this. We got interested in this procedure where for half, you're learning pairs of items. And in one case, you know they're all strong associates. So you know the word you're to learn is a strong associate of whale. What might it be? Ocean. Ocean. Okay. Then you see, oh, it's map. Now we compared that with half of the items were like this, 8 seconds of trying to predict, 5 seconds seeing the right answer. The other case, they spend the whole 13 seconds seeing the right answer. And then at a delay after all the pairs, we then show them whale in this case, and they have to try to produce the target. And manipulating various things across 4 different experiments, we found that in these cases where you test first, use up more than half of the study time, so to speak, to come up with something that's wrong. And incidentally, we arrange these materials so they're wrong 97% of the time in what they predict. You see consistently this benefit where you first produce an error and then see the right response. Now, this is still research going on this, but one factor appears to be that, incidentally, do people predict this? This was a replication carried out at Columbia University where they got the same results that I did, but they thought to ask which helped you learn better, and again, people predict just the opposite. You know, you study the right thing for 13 seconds versus produce the wrong one for 8, and then study the right one for 5. So the semantic activation thing would be if I'm just trying to predict, I activate my knowledge about whale, I think of things like ocean and dolphin and so on, and I see this and it somehow helps the mapping process. Well, this is relevant if there's time, and I think I'm okay, to using pre-testing to improve learning. That is to ask questions on material the students have yet to have been presented. In which case, again, they will mostly produce errors. And taking a test before study has been shown to be quite effective, actually, at improving learning, and that it can sort of help related information. And I'm just going to show you an example of the materials we used rather than show you the actual results. This was one where they're learning about stimulants. They were very interested in the materials in this experiment. And how many milligrams of caffeine are contained in a Jolt Cola? Well, with the multiple choice question, we envision that things like this happen. Wow, I know Jolt Cola has a lot of caffeine. But 96 seems too low. 414 just seems way too specific. Maybe this one's right. So they choose that. And then what can happen, in our view, when they study the material, like this passage, Netherlands drinks more coffee than whatever, the average person does this and that. What can happen is not just that they end up seeing the correct answer. They end up seeing other things relevant to the other alternatives they consider. And that then helps them answer other questions as well. And when we went on to look at this experimentally, we in this case actually, Elizabeth Bjork and Jerry Little rather than me, we used part of the time to give them this multiple choice pre-test and then had them study the passage for 10 minutes, or we gave them 14 minutes to just study the passage, a longer time to study it. And what you can see is the pre-tested case produced better recall for the items that are pre-tested without any cost to the other items. So again, pre-testing, even when what's produced is mostly errors, can enhance later performance. Okay, so I'm not going to summarize. You'll just have to summarize and remember it yourself. Okay. It's critical that they become competitive instead of the alternatives. But the last thing I want to talk about, and another one I'm doing a lot of research, is interleaving rather than blocking the separate components of to-be-learned knowledge and skills. In the motor skills domain, there's a large background. And it all started with this simple experiment and apparatus built by 2 graduate students in kinesiology at University of Colorado. They built this thing, and if you were a participant, what you were learning to do here was 3 different movement patterns. Each movement pattern, you had to release the start button, grab the tennis ball, knock over 3 of these hinge barriers in some orders, like left front, right middle, left middle, and put it in the second hole as fast as you could. So you learned 3 of those movement patterns, and in one case, you got 18 trials on one of those before you got 18 trials on the other pattern before you got 18 on the third. Their novel condition was you got the same 54 trials, 18 on each, but which one you had to perform on each trial was random. So an interleave random schedule of those practice versus a block schedule. Now again, this is performance across blocks of 3 trials. Down is good, they're getting faster and faster as they practice. And what you can see is the block case starts out a lot better, it gets closer, but it stays better. And importantly, if this was all you saw, you would definitely think that blocking is the way to teach somebody something. And in fact, blocking is everywhere in the real world. You decide you want to go take tennis lessons somewhere,
practice a block of forehands, a block of backhands, a block of serves. It's everywhere. It fits people's intuitions, and this actually makes it look better. But they also tested people 10 days later. Under one condition, they tested them 10 days later random. And you can see here that if you had the random training, you pretty much sustained your performance. If you had the block training, it looks like you didn't learn anything. They also ran it where the final test was under block conditions, and what little advantage there was still in favor of the random condition. So this now has been shown in many, many different forms. I'm going to skip over this because all this showed you was we replicated it, but then have people try to judge which was better, and they, as you might expect by this point, said random was better. Said block was better. So this has now been shown with people learning the 3 different serves in badminton, learning hit fastballs, change up curveballs in baseball, kayaking. This is one learning several different types of ATM machines, younger and older participants. This is one doing handwriting. I'll make a little additional comment on this one. This is an experiment by Diane St. Marie and students working with her. And if you're old enough, this will look a little familiar to you. It's a penmanship booklet that was used routinely in the schools, like in my generation. And what you can see, what you're supposed to do on this is you make a W, another W, a third W, another, until you're up to 9 W's and a bunch of X's and so on. And what Diane St. Marie and her students did was to make up an alternative penmanship books where you did the same number of writing capital letters but had them intermixed. And then tested people under different conditions later. And sure enough, there were big benefits of the children getting the interleaved practice, despite whatever intuitions the designer of such a workbook had in mind. And this benefit was particularly there if the later writing task involved alternating letters. Kind of interesting when you think about it, because a child won't have a lot of future practice making 9 W's in a row. In any case, I sometimes focus on this one because I sort of say, I feel like I'm doubly punished. In the schools, I had to do hours and hours of this kind of thing. And then some decades later, I had to grade papers of students who didn't have to do anything like that. But in any case, the new direction that I want to focus on today is the role of interleaving learning in perceptual, verbal, and conceptual skills. So all of that passed through was kind of motor performance, but we found out there's parallel findings in this case. And one critical study done by Doug Rohr and a student working with him had the students learn the formulas for different solids, like a wedge, a half cone, and so on. And so they get a practice schedule working with different dimensions, and they either did a bunch of problems blocked on, say, a wedge before moving to a spherical cone or whatever, or they had the same number of practice problems mixed up and interleaved. And then, so they're in this use, they're mixers and blockers in their terminology. And the participants are tested 1 week after a second learning session. And if you look right away, again, it looks like block practice is better. But on the final test, a week later, there's a dramatic benefit and almost no forgetting where you had the mixed practice and huge forgetting where you had the block practice. These authors thought this should be in an educational journal because it's important. And it was only the 4th journal that accepted them. Other ones, it's just interesting. Goes so much against intuitions and maybe what editors and reviewers were doing in their own teaching that they had a difficult time getting these results in press. Doug Rohr's gone on to see that these results transfer to actually learning algebra in the public schools in the South Florida area. And we had William Emeny, a teacher in England, visit our lab for a week. He was someone who was presented awarded Secondary Teacher of the Year in the Houses of Parliament for things he did in mathematic instruction. But then he sent us back this note. After learning about desirable difficulties, in particular spacing and leaving, started trying to put them into practice. I did this in a number of ways. First, I realized that we blocked up to a certain point, and then we did interleaving, and I decided to look at that. And basically what he found is across the time when they were doing blocked, it was very erratic. When they went to a final phase of interleaving, students started to show this, and then more recently, he just showed that they had incorporated interleaving throughout the whole sequence. And these are now the results they're getting from the students in his school in England. Okay, what about optimizing inductive learning? This is a very important category of learning in all of your fields, whether it's science, literature, whatever. And what that refers to is the ability to generalize concept and categories through exposure to multiple exemplars. So if you were a physician learning to read x-rays, each x-ray you read from a new patient is novel. You need to make judgments based on what you've extracted from prior exposures. And so this might be a sample of things where you're trying to extract some commonality that would let you make a judgment. And in the experimental materials that we used, I won't go into just why, we actually had people learn the styles of different painters from examples of their paintings, and I'll clarify this task in a little bit more. But I want to give you a little feeling for this. Suppose I tell you that's a Gen 2 penguin, and that's a Gen 2 penguin. That's a Gen 2 penguin. That's a Gen 2 penguin. Okay, now quick, where's the Gen 2? I see a lot of fingers pointing up there. And that is correct. But the important thing to realize, you did not see that picture. You induced and abstracted something from the examples in order to maybe this little white patch or something featured like that. So Nate Cornell was in a postdoc, and I decided this is one case where spacing would not be ideal, because if I block them like I just showed you, that makes it possible to extract commonalities. Whereas if I interleave them, show you a Gen 2, then Jesus and Reinhardt a Gen 2, that's going to make it difficult to extract the commonalities. So we got all excited. We're going to show one case where these very general spacing effects just don't hold up. So we ran the experiment with these paintings, and they learned the styles of 12 different painters by seeing 6 examples of each of their paintings. And so 12 artists, 6 paintings by each, half of them shown in a row. I'll give you an example. The other half shown interleaved. And then in the test phase, they're brand new paintings, and they have to say, who painted this one? So I'll give you a little better feeling for it. This was what a mass block would look like. It would tell you that that's a painting by Lewis. That's a painting by Lewis. There's one by Lewis. There's one by Lewis. These aren't particularly good painters. Lewis, they're unknown painters, basically. So that would be a block. Did you feel like it started getting Lewis's style induced there, the brush strokes and so on? Example would be, there's a Pisani, and now we see a Wechsler, and now we see a Schlorf, and now a Straccialat, and now Hawkins, Milrea. That's an interleave block. And this would be a sample of the first part of it, where you might see 6 Lewises. Then you see an interleave block where you wouldn't, if you see a Pisani there, you're not going to see another Pisani until a lot of other paintings have gone by. Then you might see a whole bunch of Hawkins and so on. And then the test, as I said, you see a new painting and you have to pick out who painted it. So, completely opposite to what we expected, a sizable benefit of interleaving. And what made this initial study have a big impact is we happened to throw in another question. Oh, big impact meaning it was followed up in lots of ways and shown with all these other materials. Then there was a notion that older learners might need to see block their kids, and all of these are replications of the blocking advantage. Well, we threw in this question: what do you think helped you learn more, masked or spaced? Just at the end. Now realize this is after the test on which they had performed better spaced interleaving. That's in fact the actual results. How many people did better spaced? They were the same, better interleaved. This is what they said. And now this has been replicated a bunch of times. A very compelling notion that the blocking is better. And what we now think is the case that maybe the original hypothesis that lets you see similarities might have some truth to it. But what appears to be more important is that interleaving highlights the differences between the artists. And that may be more important in a lot of these kind of tests. Why is this judgment of blocking so difficult to overcome? Well, one thing is that as you go through, and that's one reason I showed you some of the items, you get this sense of fluency. I see it, I'm getting it. That's one thing. But the participants also come to an experiment with a belief that blocking is better. Blocking is what has been done. That is what their teachers done. That is what lots of your course syllabi do. Blocking. Recent evidence is that if you let people choose, they will choose blocking. So this is an experiment where they're learning families of birds. And they get, these are just examples of the pictures, and there might be 3 different versions of what jays look like. But basically what the researchers did was, what you've just seen as a jay, click on the bird family you'd like to study next. What did they click on? They basically overwhelmingly choose to see another jay, and in fact they tend to choose to see all the jays before they go on to any other. They give themselves block practice. So, I've got 10 minutes, right? Yeah. Okay, so the next few things I'll jump across. We've tried to explore just what would it take to get people to say that interleaving is better. And in this experiment, we run the same experiment I just showed you, but then before they're asked which is better, we either replicate what we did before, just no special instructions. We actually tell them that 90% do better interleaving before they judge which helped them learn better. This one's even more heavy-handed. We tell them 90%, although massing might have felt better. This one, we give them that, and we even say why intermixing might help. And basically, the one result I want to focus on in particular, in this case, we tell them 90% do better interleaved. About 80% of the people think they're in the other 10%. And what I'm skipping over here is just questions having to do with, I will show this one. If you were to teach, what schedule would you use? The people who did better blocked said they would do block. There were very many of them. People who did better interleave, even those people said half the time they would use interleave. It's very difficult to get this to be overcome. So the thing I want to kind of conclude with is, what is it that students already know and not know about how to study? So this question came to our mind, and Nate Cornell and I decided to survey introductory psych students at UCLA, 472 of them, with just some simple questions. One was, how do you decide what to study next? Almost 60%. Whatever is due soonest, most overdue. 4%, whatever I haven't studied for the longest time. That would be what? It's a quiz, I suppose. A benefit of that would be spacing.
Yeah, this is
Whatever I find interesting didn't play any real role. Whatever I'm doing worse in a little bit. And then 11% said, I plan my study schedule ahead of time and I study whatever I schedule. And they're actually liars. If you quiz yourself when you study, why do you do so? Here they show the failure to appreciate that they learn more that way, that it can be more powerful. They do appreciate that benefit of testing, by and large, that it helps them know what they need to study and not. They don't find quizzing horrible. These people do not quiz themselves, and that's too bad. Usually return to course material to review it, 86%. And of course would be wonderful spacing kind of things. When you do you typically read a textbook article, other source material more than once? Only 16% say they do the whole thing. 60% say they read what they highlighted or marked earlier. And these people are probably in trouble, 23%. Now this is a key. When you say you study the way you taught because a teacher or teachers taught you to study that way, notice that only 20% say yes, that they were taught something about how to study. And we can speculate on whether what they were taught was good or bad. But notice that it's kind of amazing in a way that we worry about student preparedness in math and English and their tests when they come. We don't sort of worry whether they've got this set of skills in place for this 4, 5, 6 year massive learning enterprise in terms of how they're going to go about it and what they know and what's productive and what's not productive. So when we think of desirable difficulties, we could really have a good discussion now with this particular audience, is what are the implications of these for the design of instruction? How do I introduce variation, interleaving, spacing using tests? What are the ways to do that? And I'll bet you if we had time to really stop everything right now, you would come up with things that we, Elizabeth and I, and people work with us, have never thought about. And that's often what's missing. When we've talked to teachers and so on, we've often been asked, wow, this is really interesting. Do you have a manual on how to apply these things? And of course, we don't. But how to implement those, they have very interesting implications. I mean, one is just straightforward. If the interleaving results hold up the way they appear to be, then really when we structure our course syllabi, where we often try to attempt to be well organized to cover something and drop it and so on, move on to another thing. If something's important, it needs to be revisited. If you have an interest in subjects 6 months even later, recalling key concepts, those ideas and what have to come up more than once, and so much the better if after a delay in another context. So really, if you incorporate all these things, you'd produce a course syllabus and a set of activities that would look quite different than most course syllabi do. But some of the things that you've talked about here in the posters and elsewhere are actually incorporating a lot of these things. However, what about this? What are the implications for the evaluation? Students expect to be taught the way they've been taught. The sense of creating a sense of difficulty isn't going to make you especially popular with them. I've sometimes told people that after all these years and decades of teaching, if you give me a new course and give me one challenge, which is do everything you know how to do, so that students a year later would be able to recall and use the key concept and ideas of the course. I know now how I would set up everything in the course. But if you told me, do everything you know how to do to get the highest possible course evaluations in your course, I'm a little embarrassed to say I know how to do that too. But the tragic thing is those would not be the same courses. So, just a couple of concluding comments. Prevailing attitudes and assumptions that get in the way of our becoming effective learners and teachers. One is that errors and mistakes rather be viewed as an essential component of learning or simply reflect the inadequacy of the learner or the instructor, or maybe both. Differences in performance between individuals are attributed to innate differences in ability. Basically, aptitude is overappreciated. The amazing power of training, practice, experience,